Well, hi everyone. Good to see everyone here. So it's been an exciting and enlightening few days. As on Think Tanks, as we always kind of come to expect. We're certainly glad to see that the whole COVID situation hasn't dampened everyone's appetites, to learn from each other. So thanks for joining us on this. We've somewhat grandly titled this session a think tank model of storytelling, principally because of two slides that we presented 2 years ago. These slides, for some odd reason, seem to touch a nerve. And we found many people have quoted those slides back to us since, and we thought it was time to build on these as we're starting to talk about narratives and storytelling, in a slightly more substantial way. I don't know if any of you were in Isabel and Karen's session earlier on, but it's great to see these conversations happening. So I'll come back to those slides shortly, but first, I guess let's introduce ourselves. So, hi, I'm Aidan. I'm a partner at Cast from Clay. You might have known us previously as We Are Flint. We're a communications agency, and we were founded in the wake of Brexit in the UK and then the election of Trump in the US. And as believers in evidence-based policy, we were concerned by the fact that experts were failing to make an impact on policy at a time when it mattered most. And we wanted to make, by creating our own modest contribution to this challenge through what we know, which is communication policy. Katy, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Katy. I'm Senior Account Manager at Cast from Clay. I've been here for about 1.5 years, and I actually came to work for Cast from Clay because of the slides and some of the thinking that we're going to present here in this presentation. I was working as communications manager in a think tank here in London, and came across some of the thinking that Aidan and Tom and the guys at Cast from Clay were doing, and really resonated with what I was trying to do there at the think tank, which was to think about how we can communicate our research findings more engagingly in a way that would resonate with people. So yeah, and that's how I came to be working here, because I really believed in some of the thinking that we're going to present here. So hopefully some of you will find it helpful too.
Lizzie?
Yeah, I'm Lizzie, and I'm head of communications at Theos think tank. I also came across this excellent little slide about storytelling and communications when I met Aidan and Tom about 2 years ago. And my background is not think tanks. My background is actually strategic communications agencies, and prior to that, advertising. So I've got, I suppose, a fair background in thinking about the art of persuasion and narratives. And I came to my job at Theos certainly with a view to telling some of the stories that we were telling and presenting some of the research that we had in a more creative and engaging way. So I'm going to share some examples of that just towards the end of the presentation. Stay tuned.
Cool. Thanks, all. So these are the two slides that we mentioned. So the first one set out like the standard model of think tank communications, with the report at the heart of all communications activity, and a number of activations that follow, events, press release, tweets, etc. Some of you might recognize this. And so what we suggested at the time was that in a world where facts, had alternative facts, where news was called fake, we might be better served by a communication model which focused on the story instead, and recognized that the report was one more communication asset. Much to our surprise, these two slides seem to resonate, and as I mentioned, they've often been quoted back to us. And whenever this happened, we found that the conversation inevitably veered towards a question which went something like this. Okay, so we agree in principle, but what does storytelling actually look like, and how do we make it happen? So we've had a bit of time to think about it, and we'd like to take you through some of our thinking about how we might start to define a framework for storytelling for think tanks. And as a heads up, this hasn't yet been published, by the way, so we're using this as an opportunity to stress test some ideas, so please be indulgent with us. So three things we'd like to discuss. First, before we get into storytelling, the need to recognize and embrace the new policy dynamic. Secondly, Katy will be setting out the need to take people as they are and not as the considered, balanced, fact-absorbing people that we wish they would be. And thirdly, we want to start to identify maybe what a think tank model of storytelling might look like. So first of all, let's start by looking at the new policy landscape. And let's start by talking specifically about what's changed. So up until about 10, 15 years ago, policy experts only really had to focus on policymakers and the mainstream media. And the reason being, it was the interplay between the two of those that set the policy agenda. And sure, public opinion mattered, but it was fed in through things like focus groups and public opinion surveys, and the public remained a passive actor in this whole thing. And then 15 years ago, things changed with the rise of social media, which has given the public a voice. It's messy, it's loud, but it's quite a powerful force, as everyone, I'm sure recognizes by now. And it's turned what used to be a bipolar dynamic into a tripolar dynamic. With this, have come a few impacts, but there are two in particular we'd like to discuss. First of all, the rise of the commentator. This is well documented, so I'm not going to spend any time on it, but if you're interested, check out the Reuters Institute at Oxford University. And then secondly, the idea of the human experience and emotion are just as valid as fact. And don't take just our word for this. This is from an interview from the BBC's Newsnight. Some of you might recognize Anthony Scaramucci, who shared some insight about Trump's base. And if anyone is taking solace from his defeat, let's remember that his base still accounts for close to half of the US population, and their cousins exist in many of our respective countries. So let's not take our foot off the pedal on this. But anyway, Anthony Scaramucci said the politics of blue-collar people are based on emotion, and that's basically feeling they've been underrepresented. And he also said President Trump probably even knows he's not saying the truth. What you need to understand about his base is they don't care. And the reality is that in this world, it's not the best facts that win, it's the best story. And if anyone at this point is thinking, well, thank God our audience is policymakers rather than just the general public, we have some terrible news for you, which it turns out the policymakers are people too. And in 2014, two researchers, Aidan and Desh, looked into what policymakers actually want from academics and policy experts. And this is what they found, which is that policymakers don't want facts, they want arguments. They want frameworks to help them understand the complex world that they live in. And put simply, what they want is stories. So I'm going to hand over to Katy at this point, who'll talk about dealing with human behavior.
Yeah, thanks. Can you just jump to the next slide, Aidan? Thank you. So all of this is to say that we need to take people. Oh, sorry, there's a bit of a lag. Maybe just on the holding slide for now. Slide 2. All of this is to say that we need to take people as they are rather than as we want them to be. So it's been nice to hear some of this resonating in some of the other sessions too. So in Laura and Keith's session yesterday, touched upon the fact that people are more likely to remember stories than they are facts, and also in the narrative session earlier, that the power of storytelling and narrative, and that people, including all of us, all of ourselves, and not the rational human beings that we like to think that we are. And this is not us saying, we don't care about facts anymore. It's much more about the role that facts play within a wider practice of storytelling. So it's facts and not instead of facts. So if you could go to the next slide, this we found to be a really, really good indicator of this in practice. So this is from Bobby Duffy's book, Perils of Perception, which some of you may be familiar with, from a few years ago, and presents data that they explored around asking people what they thought the percentage of immigrant population was in their country. So this graph shows the lighter color, the pink at the top bar, is what people guessed the proportion of their population was immigrant in their country. And below is the reality. And probably you would have seen versions of this type of data in the news or online. But the more interesting thing we found with it was within that book, what happened when people were then challenged on the data. And what they report was that even after people were shown that the numbers were much lower, the actual proportion of immigrants in their population was much lower than they had guessed. They actually insisted that their original estimate was accurate. So even when proposed with sort of contradictory facts, people often just held on to the fact of, well, that's nice, but I think it's this. I think it's higher than that. I think it's this amount, and that was usually because they felt that maybe the government figures were wrong, or they would just say, "I just don't believe you." So this is to some extent a challenge, and it speaks to George Lakoff's what he puts across in his book, Don't Think of an Elephant, is that one of the findings, fundamental findings of cognitive science is that people think in terms of frames and metaphors. So when the facts don't fit frames, the frames are kept, but the facts are ignored. And as I mentioned, this is a challenge to all of us who believe in the value of facts and evidence, particularly their role within policy and decision making. Now, through our own research, we wanted to know about the role within kind of policy making of this question of frames and facts, of rational versus the more emotional. And so we did some research last year, and one of the questions that we asked people was how much they agree with the statement. When it comes to politics, I go with my heart over my head. And we actually segmented the responses by political insiders who are, I suppose, work within policy themselves, directly at the heart of policy making. Activists who are probably, policy making adjacent, but maybe work more in the kind of NGO, non-profit sector, campaigning, or involved in political movements. The engaged, who are maybe someone who's taken a political action that year, so gone to a protest or signed a petition, and then spectators who are kind of following politics, reading the news, seeing what goes on Twitter, but aren't necessarily getting actively involved. And what we saw was that in the insiders, political insiders were more likely to agree with that statement. When it comes to politics, I go with my heart over my head. And again, this kind of came as a surprise to us, and is really kind of an interesting point of discussion. Is it that political insiders are a lot more emotional, whereas actually people separate from politics are much more likely to be rational because they're at a distance? We suspected that it was more likely that potentially political insiders are just a lot more aware that they're much more likely to make kind of more emotional that their political decisions and thoughts are not necessarily always driven by kind of facts and rationality than someone who isn't there day to day. And separate, so to kind of explore this idea more of the sense that maybe the political insiders are more self-aware, or that we asked people, okay, well, we looked at the data about what people said. When it comes to politics, I go with my heart over my head. People responded, 25% agreed with that statement. But when we compared that to what they felt other people did, so when it comes to me, I mostly follow my head over my heart. But when it came to other people, they were much more able to identify the fact that maybe their friends and family, for example, make much more kind of emotional, heart-based decisions than the kind of more rational, facts-based. So we're much better at kind of being able to notice this in other people than we are to kind of admit that ourselves, that maybe we are a lot more kind of leading with our hearts than our heads. So I think if we go into the next slide, all of this is just seeing humans at work, really. And so what we want to do is kind of just recognize that these dynamics are at play, and rather than kind of wishing this wasn't true, how can we work with that? And at Cast from Clay, we think that storytelling is one route to working better with these kind of more human dynamics. I'll hand back to Aidan now.
Thanks, Katy. So at this point, we'd like to explore a few ideas on how we can actually move towards a model of storytelling that works for think tanks. So that same piece of research that I mentioned earlier into what policymakers want from researchers also found this, that research papers that exceed 10 to 15 pages are not useful to policymakers. And yet, this is like the model that we base our communications on. And so back to where we started, how do we actually make this happen? Is there still a lag on the slides, by the way?
I'm seeing a slight one, but it might just be me.
Well, I'll go slowly. First, let's start by defining a few terms. For example, we hear a lot of terms being used, stories, narratives, plots, etc. So, what's the difference between stories and narratives? For start, well, I think stories are the things that happen to people. So you get stories from lived experiences, from your friends, from your family, and also from the news and social media. And narratives, on the other hand, are shaped by a collection of stories, from all of those sources. So narratives occur at a personal level, they occur at a community level, and they also occur at a societal level. And so, to use an example, the American dream is a societal narrative, a story that that the Americans tell themselves, and which shapes their society. And crucially, narratives have a direction of travel. And I think at this point, it's important to recognize that narratives operate as a curating filter. So when stories don't fit with a narrative, they're simply filtered out, to the point that George Lakoff was making. And this is why narrative change is so hard to achieve, because it takes more than a couple of stories to change the course of a narrative. And it's only when contradictive stories start outnumbering the stories supporting the prevalent narrative that narrative change actually becomes possible. And so our point is this: we all have our own, a small role to play in telling our story, our organization's story, our community's story, and to help to shape the environment that we live in. And it's no one organization's responsibility, but if we all kind of do a little bit of storytelling, then we might be able to change a far bigger narrative. And it's also a recognition that research doesn't get released into a vacuum. So with that in mind, we think that storytelling exists at two levels for think tanks. The first level we call the message. So that level is where your research exists. So to get your message across, you need to tell the human story behind the data. And then the second level that we talk about is the environment. So this is where the narrative lives, and it's a far longer term project, but you need to work on shaping the environment over time by communicating your own version of history, your own vision of society, and basically start to answer the question, what does your world look like? And we recognize that some of you at this point may be thinking, well, this is way outside the remit of a think tank. And so we asked 100 UK members of parliament, a representative sample of the current party split, what they thought the role of a think tank should be today. And this is what they said. Only 1 in 3 of them, of respondents, thought think tanks do enough to explain policy ideas to the public. And over half of them thought that think tanks need to do more. And again, over half of them thought that think tanks have a duty, beyond publishing reports, to articulate their vision of society, and only 14% of them disagreed with that statement. So what does storytelling actually look like? Well, the standard model of storytelling that we kind of use. Some of you may have come across this before. It's called Freytag's pyramid, and in its modern form, it basically starts with an exposition phase, then a phase of rising action, which culminates in a climax, and then followed it's followed on by a phase of falling action, and ultimately the denouement. So we're kind of thinking, well, what about think tanks? Could it look something like this? So at the message level that we discussed earlier, assuming that you're working up to the climax of the publication of the report, we start off by framing the conversation in anticipation of publication day, maybe explaining why the policy landscape is what it is through a bit of history, and introducing the protagonists. So, who are the protagonists? Maybe the individuals and organizations who paved the way to where we are today, and potentially the ones who will shape the outcome, of the policy debate. Then, moving on to the rising action phase, you tell the human story as well as the factual story. Who will this policy affect? And then you publish the reports, along with recommendations. In falling action, you take part in the policy debates, you offer media commentary, and until the decision is finally reached, and then the outcome feeds into your version of history. Now, traditionally, think tanks have been quite good at starting at the climax and then carrying on with the falling action of the denouement with no kind of no thought given to the exposition and the rising action. But we also consider shaping the environment, the environment at level that we were talking about, by communicating first of all your version of history, your organization story, your values, your assumptions, and engaging the existing narratives and communicating what your vision of society is. And that level of society, that level of storytelling, rather, is aimed at a more long-term view to frame the debate through core ongoing communications. And this in turn will then help frame the next project whenever it comes along, because you've done that. So I'll leave it here for now, and we'd love to hear your thoughts shortly. But before we do, I just want to hand over to Lizzie from Theos think tank. So for context, we invited Lizzie to speak because Theos have been doing some quite amazing work in the UK, to be honest, from a storytelling point of view. And Lizzie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I'm speaking out of turn by saying Theos are a small to mid-sized think tank, which makes it all the more remarkable that they've been punching well above their weight, through telling human stories, framing the debate around the role of religion and spirituality in a modern society. So I'll hand over to Lizzie at this point. Over to you.
Thanks, Aidan. Thanks, Katy. Yes. So as I said at the start, I am head of communications at Theos think tank, and Theos are quite an unusual type of a think tank. So we actually exist to enrich the conversation about faith and belief in society. So we think that there is untapped wisdom in faith traditions that can speak into some of the big questions about how we live well today. And we're interested in getting into the bloodstream of ideas and conversations about kind of bigger existential questions, what it means to be human, how we live well together as a society. So that can be anything from the ethics of artificial intelligence, the future of work, what dementia says about the human person. And we also do kind of more specific projects around anything from university belief on campus to the economy. It's basically a very, very varied remit. So Aidan, do you want to go on to the next slide? So some of you may recognise this painting. It is a painting by Vincent van Gogh, and it is called The Parable of the Sower. And I thought that this would be quite a useful way to just explain a bit about our approach to our work, because actually it ties very closely to what Aidan's just been talking about. So the parable of the sower, for those of you that aren't familiar, is actually a biblical story which talks about a farmer that sowed his seed on lots of different types of soil. He sowed it on rocky ground, he sowed it on ground with weeds, and he sowed it on good soil, and only the soil and the seed that fell on good soil bore fruit. Why am I talking about the parable of the sower? Well, I think we see our work at Theos as kind of twofold. So one is preparing the soil, which Aidan referred to as the environment, and two is scattering seeds. We recognise that as a faith and belief think tank, we are operating in an increasingly secular society. So we're not speaking into a neutral space. And many of the audiences that we want to engage will actually have preconceptions. Some will see religion and faith as irrelevant and outdated, and actually some will be downright suspicious. The prevailing narrative around faith and belief is not always a positive one. So I think this requires a certain level of environmental storytelling. And in this analogy, I suppose you could describe the soil as the environment and the message as the seeds. So I wanted to share a case study of a project which I think is a wider environmental project, and then three very short examples of some specific projects so that you can kind of tie the storytelling back to actual think tank research, because at the end of the day, we are actually a think tank of researchers. There's, I think, 14 or 15 of us, and I'll show you at the end how many of us are the comms team, but we are predominantly a research-based think tank. So next slide, please. So the first case I wanted to talk a little bit about is a podcast that we started up in 2017. It's called the Sacred Podcast, and it was actually developed, not unlike Cast from Clay, in response to an increasingly fractured public conversation. So this was kind of just post Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. And the Sacred Podcast really set out to find a way of having more productive, less combative ways of talking across our divides, finding ways to open up questions about faith, belief and unbelief. It intended to open up a space for those in the public conversation to explore what they hold sacred. So this, for me, I think this was tilling the soil. The key question that we asked on the podcast, every podcast, was what do you define as sacred? So we asked a broad range of voices, some very well known, some much less known, what they held as sacred, because I suppose at the heart of it, we felt that if you took away all religious terminology, I know the sacred sounds like quite a religious word, but what we meant by the sacred was, what would you fight to defend to the death? If someone was to kind of wrestle you to the ground, your core value that you would say defines your motivations and what makes you tick. So this is what we were wanting to get to the heart of, because we really believe that actually if we understand each other's sacred values, we see each other as human and we find a way to engage across our great differences. Next slide, please. So this is a really nice quote I want to show you. This was a quote from one of the from just one of our episodes of the podcast. Somebody said, "I don't believe in God, but I miss him," which we thought was just kind of quite profound, speaks to this kind of deeper existential sense of yearning and searching for kind of belonging. Interestingly, we actually began to speak to a very broad range of voices. So we would speak to religious people, to atheists, to agnostics, anyone from politicians, poets, journalists, scientists, and we kind of started up this conversation. Next slide, please. And actually what the interesting thing was that we found, as we started to ask these questions, as we opened up this conversation, we found that actually people were a lot more interested in it than we thought they might be. So there's 3 little examples there I'll just quickly go through. For any of you that are familiar with the IT Crowd, which is a British comedy series, we came into contact with Richard Ayoade, who is pictured there. And he struck up a bit of a relationship and a friendship, and actually then got him and his wife, Lydia Fox, who's an actress, to do a live event with us where we spoke to them as a couple. We did a live sacred podcast, and Aidan was there actually. Feels like a lifetime ago. Then kind of coming out of that, amazingly as these things go, Russell Brand, the kind of media personality Russell Brand, like him or loathe him, heard about what we were doing, thought it was really interesting, and invited Elizabeth, the podcast host, onto his podcast, Under the Skin, and then proceeded to tweet us out to his 11.4 million followers. So needless to say, our social feed was very busy that day. And then we got an unexpected call from Rainn Wilson, who is Dwight Schrute from The American Office, the TV series, telling us that he'd actually really love to come on our podcast because he'd heard about it, and he is of the Baha'i faith, and he wanted to have a conversation. So really, really interesting. So how does this relate to storytelling? Well, I think The Sacred is a really interesting example because we had started to tell a different story around faith and belief. And we'd opened up a conversation to those with kind of big influences and followers, people that were actually part of our culture and our broader conversation, and we were engaging with them. Next slide, please. So by this point, we actually we got some amazing content. We were 65 episodes in, and I'll skip back just very briefly. We had the opportunity to fund a communications position on our team. There was 1.5 of us at the time. This was last year in 2019. And I had the opportunity to hire someone, and I decided to hire an animator because I thought, what does every good think tank need? Needs an animator. So we found a very talented young animator that we hired 3 days a week. And we had started to kind of explore how we could use animation to start to tell stories of our research and to tie into some of these things. So long story short, we pitched for some grant funding, and we actually got some grant funding to produce a series of animated assets. So I'm just going to play you a very short clip of this animation, which is actually a segment, one of the Sacred podcast episodes just lifted out. This is actually on the festival circuit at the moment, the documentary filmmaking festival circuit, and isn't released yet. So you're getting a preview of it.
A lot of people have a sense that something profound about our humanity is lost. If we think about our lives simply chasing one dream after the next, our lives and to lose weight.
So I think that was probably a little bit glitchy for some of you watching, but you get the gist. There's a story there about what it means to exist in community, we were kind of quite excited about that work. So that's a Sacred podcast. And now just quickly, those examples I thought might seem a little bit unrelatable to the day-to-day work of think tanks. So I wanted to just show a few examples of some actual kind of research reports that basically we've just tried to weave this storytelling approach into. So next slide. Great. So this first one, Forgive Us Our Debts. This was a report actually that looked at the issue of debt. And one of the things that I found when I was talking to the researcher about it was just trying to get the heart of the story, was that actually there's a theological understanding of debt. Debt back in kind of olden times was actually a reciprocal relationship between a borrower and a lender. So debt wasn't in and of itself a really bad thing. Whereas I think today when we think of debt, obviously the connotations of it are all negative. So we started to think, how could we actually paint a different picture about the way that debt could become a relationship again between a borrower and a lender? And so we actually kind of, I don't know if you can see it, but the line says debt is intended to serve people, but has it instead made a slave of us? So we created a short animation, and this was even before we had our animator in house, just to basically kind of just try and tell that human story around what is potentially a bit of a dry subject to people that aren't economists. The second example is a very current one. It's called Growing Good. This is a report that we've just launched. And very simply, it's actually about growth of social action through churches, and how in a culture where there's increasing austerity and obviously COVID, the need is greater, that churches are actually a great volunteering base for social action. As a result of that, I did a shoot in the pandemic, which was probably cost me years of my life. And I went and met 11 of the people that had been part of the case studies, and we photographed them and we just told their story. And actually, it's been a really amazing way to just bring the research to life, because the stories, very human stories around the people that are impacted by this work. And the third one, I don't know whether we've got time, so I might just talk about it, but this is a report which is yet to launch, actually, called Worldviews in Religious Education. And this research actually is about the fact that religious education in schools is actually incredibly outdated. Young people are quite bored by it, and an increasingly secular society. There has to be a better way to think about faith and belief. When 83% of the world's population is actually religious, and that's predicted to go up to 90% in, I think, 2050, according to Pew Research. So we've suggested that the concept of worldview, so everybody looks through a certain lens, and this isn't just our research, but it's research that's been done by some partners of ours at Canterbury University as well. So this is a short animation that we're working on, which talks about that. And I think I'm probably a bit over time, so maybe, shall I show the little clip? Aidan, is it worth doing?
Yeah, let's show a little bit of it.
It's an animatic, so it's not a final animation, but it will just give you an idea.
What is your view of the world? How do you see things? What makes you who you are? On what do you base your decisions? Why did you react like that? Do you believe in God or a higher power? Or do you see the world as a cocktail of chance and accident? Everyone has a worldview, whether religious or not. Each individual sees the world through a certain lens. It may be shaped by their upbringing, surroundings, or religion, and it can change as you move through life. It is important to think about your own worldview. Worldview can be both personal and organisational. It is a set of attitudes and deeply held beliefs that shape how you live. What about the worldviews of those around you? Do you understand them? They may not be as similar to yours as you expect. Or perhaps your worldviews will be more alike than you assumed. Some may believe life is about success and improvement, being the best you can be. And some think it's about helping the most vulnerable in society. Others may believe belonging to a group is vital for finding meaning, while another treasures belonging to the earth in all its beauty. And still, most of us will not see the world through only one lens, but rather through a blend of multiple visions. In an increasingly pluralistic society, understanding the world around us means realizing that there is no neutral perspective. Nobody stands nowhere. Do you know where you stand? And why?
So yeah, that's an animation currently in progress, which we're quite excited about, really. I think probably is a good place to end. So Aidan, do you want to just skip to that last slide? It might just be a useful grounding and encouragement maybe to some of you that might be looking at that and thinking, well, we don't have budget for an animator and we can't do all these things. But this is actually the headcount of Theos in 2018 and the headcount of Theos in 2020. The red is researchers and the yellow and green is communications and events and fundraising. We haven't dramatically changed that and we haven't added loads of headcount, but we have put communications at the heart of our organisation. And I think that's really helped us to embrace this storytelling approach that Aidan and Katy have been talking about.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Lizzie. That was really, really useful. I love that video at the end because it feels really about worldview. It feels like that's what we're talking about and what has been touched on a lot in the other sessions is that nobody nobody stands nowhere, that everyone's got perspective, and that includes think tanks. We're opening up to discussion now, so if anyone has any thoughts or comments, feel free to put them into the chat, or even join us on stage, if that's how it works. I also really, just while we're waiting to see if anyone has any thoughts, really like the fact that you went for an animator, because it reminded me of something in the Narrative Power report that said that we almost need to, that human beings find it really hard to kind of change course when they don't know what they're heading towards, and that we almost need to kind of create an idea or a picture of what we're moving towards, and that in a way that you kind of almost need an animator to do that, because they're having to actually imagine something rather than use something that already exists. And I guess I wondered, from the more kind of internal, you kind of alluded to the internal structures and processes at the end, whether there were any battles that you had to fight to convince people that it was specifically an animator that you need and not someone who was going to proofread a PDF or that sort of thing. Did you have any difficulty there, and how did you make that case?
I think I was very lucky. We've got a very kind of progressive and forward-thinking director at Theos, who hired me from a completely different background. I think had been thinking that, this is not to say you don't need a press officer, I think that's actually really important, but hired me over a press officer, and I had a creative agency comms background. So I think when we went to have that conversation, it really was, do we need a digital strategist? Do we need a press officer, or do we need a creative? And I think we all kind of actually unanimously agreed. So I was quite lucky in the sense of getting that through.
Yeah, and that the last slide you showed as well reminded me of a piece that Louise Ball, who I think might be in the session, wrote for On Think Tanks about making the case for why think tanks should be 50% comms, 50% researchers, and whether that's is that an ambition of yours, or are you feeling like you guys have the right balance now?
I'm speaking as someone that feels utterly knackered, having done about 3 research report launches in 5 weeks. The last one of which is next week, and one was yesterday night. But I do think as we've become more ambitious, actually it has put more strain on the comms team, but I think that's kind of exciting. Like, we just keep pushing ourselves to do things better, and I just feel quite lucky that we've got an animator in house. I've got a kind of comms manager that I work with, but I think yeah, I mean, probably one extra person might be useful, but I actually just think that if you I think it can work quite well. The balance we've got at the moment is maybe kind of three of us to maybe kind of 7 or 8 researchers, and I think that's quite a good balance.
I've got a question for you, which is, like, can you tell us a little bit about, like, how you engage with, like, the researchers within, like, within Theos, like, what did that first engagement look like, and, like, and how you kind of could, like, go into kind of like identifying the stories in the, like, in the reports. And,
yeah, good question. And it's all relational, isn't it, at the end of the day? I mean, I think it always kind of comes down to building that trust. And I think actually, I really think they were very open when I came in, and quite excited about, shamelessly, I'll say, we looked at examples in an away day where I showed them examples of the kind of comms that I thought were really exciting, and I got them to show me the kind of examples. And so, Ian McGilchrist, the Divided Brain with the RSA Animate series, came up a number of times, and the team said, this is such a great way of explaining a really complex concept. So obviously, like, it was great because they were kind of brought into the process. And I think generally I haven't had much opposition really from the researchers, because ultimately they pour their lives and their heart and soul into the research, and they really do want it to go somewhere. So they tend to be quite up for kind of more creative approaches.
Yeah, that's sort of a bit of a discussion in the chat, talking about at what point comms should be brought into the research process. And Merlin Francis says the earlier the better, which I would definitely agree with from my own experience of working in comms in a think tank, and feeling like, at least in some cases, feeling like comms we'd come in, you know, once the report was kind of written, and preparing it to be disseminated, which, you know, the kind of further upstream we could get into the process. Also, even change the way that you know, that you actually found the story within the research, and thinking about the different audiences and the story that might be relevant to the different audiences at hand. Because, like you said, you know, you've got research on one hand, you've got podcast that, you know, presumably has an audience that goes beyond just the kind of more of a policy audience, and that might start to bring people in. And yeah, I have lots of memories of sort of trying to fight my way into research meetings, and, well, not fight, but get my way into research meetings to think through that. But also that maybe it could also change. I wonder if you've seen it change the way in which research is done at the organisation, just because I remember thinking things like, oh, you guys are doing loads of interviews as part of the research. Is there a way that there could be an element of those interviews that could be recorded in audio and used as part of the kind of, you know, engaging people in the research? So there were always so many great quotes like that from the more quality research. And if you've seen that change at all within your
I think two thoughts on that. One is that I'm actually part of developing the pitch to funders. So for any project we do now, I actually read through the proposal and put together a comms budget, and we have a discussion initially about the project. And I've kind of really pushed for that, because I've said, actually, you can't just put a chunk of money in when actually we may need to do something bigger, and actually we could just pitch for more if it's something more ambitious. So I would advocate for comms being a kind of consistent part of the process, certainly right at the beginning with the pitch, but also then kind of with kind of the halfway point with early findings, just to get a bit of a sense, and then obviously much more in the final stages, because I just think you get a better outcome that way. And in terms of what you just said, it's really interesting. I had a bit of a battle on my hands. I did with the researchers about ethics. And I know that obviously some of the sessions we've talked about ethics, we've talked about interviewing people and the ethics of sharing stories. And on this particular project, I talked about Growing Good, which has just launched yesterday. Had some quite kind of like tricky conversations actually with some of the researchers that said, well, we can't share their stories, it's unethical, they've signed a kind of disclaimer, etc., etc. And I actually had to take a process of me kind of coming back to them and saying, well, look, if I engage with them directly, we have a release form, say they're happy to tell their stories, there is a way that we can do this in follow-up. So you guys have done the groundwork. We found what the most compelling stories are, and then I went back and actually with a photographer, this was about 4 weeks ago, went back with a photographer and a reporter, and we basically just captured all those stories, and we obviously had release forms and people said they were happy with the stories. But that's just to kind of touch on that element of it, because I think that can be a concern.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I'm just reading some of the chat.
Yeah. So like, lots of thoughts about research and comms. Do you think it's important to train researchers on communication? Some seem to avoid communication aspects entirely. Interesting. Do you guys have any thoughts?
Have you done much training, like internally, like Lizzie, on kind of communications, or?
Depends what element of communications. We've done some media training for the researchers, and that's possibly about it. We get them to write op-ed pitches, which is our way of trying to force them to kind of distill down their massive report into a very short paragraph. It's not really training, but I think, you know, it's useful.
I see, like, you know, a few names like Isabel, Caroline, etc., and in the group. If you want to come and join us, like, you know, and kind of like, if you have any thought to share on this, like, you know, please feel free to you know, to join. I don't quite know how to look at it, how you can do that. I'm sure Eric.
I think there's a button where people can invite themselves in with a blue button on the top right, I think. I suppose on that, in the researchers of avoiding communications, I think that can be a really tricky one in terms of just people's relationship with their work, and from some of my experience, there's a sense that almost the more you know about something, the less you feel you know about it. I think it's called a something phenomenon. I can't remember the name of it, but some of that is then about the kind of relationship with the research leading to a sort of a sense of lack of confidence and saying, oh, I can't say this because I don't quite know everything about it. I think in some ways, to get really meta, communications it can be communications telling the story of the value of communications within an organization as well. So thinking about the fact that Helen Dempster, Centre for Global Development, mentioned that sometimes she changes talking about communications to talking about impact. So to talk about framing, that's a really good example of that, and thinking about, okay, it's not communications for communication's sake. The point of communications is to kind of get that research out to the kind of audiences and make sure that research is having the desired impact. So I think that can be an interesting way of reframing communications if people are maybe avoiding it or struggling with it internally as well.
I noticed there was a question further up in the thread from Daniel about targeting storytelling to fundraising private sector sources as well as government international agencies. I would say that we at Theos are more kind of private sector. We often pitch to kind of trust funds and foundations. So it tends to be government agencies, but I would say, I mean, do jump on the chat if I misrepresent your question, but I think it's probably the same approach all the way through, really. I think you can share examples of really effective storytelling, and maybe I would advocate for you with pitching to kind of private sector fundraising, maybe share some examples of the types of things that you could be doing. Certainly, I think that always helps in a pitch, is actually giving kind of concrete examples of really good storytelling, because, you know, this is my creative agency background, but you just capture people when you show an example of something, and then obviously they kind of buy into it much better. So I would say that.
Can you on that? Can you give us an indication of what the balance of of the communications that Theos does, between kind of project-based funding versus core funding, because that's something that often kind of gets often a question that gets raised about how do you kind of communicate about or how do you get involved in kind of broader kind of efforts to communicate the narratives if most of the funding is project based. So how do you look at that? How do you look at that?
I think that is really a challenge. I think we've got 50% core funding, which kind of covers my role and a few other things, and everything else is kind of project based. So in that sense, I mean, we don't have it as much maybe as other think tanks do. So we're lucky we're able to do things like the Sacred, although that actually is funded by a grant and a foundation. So some of our salaried roles are kind of core funded. That's probably the difference, which just means that we don't have to take every research project that comes in. But we do also recognise that there is this challenge of kind of your research agenda being dictated by the funding. And we have the same challenges sometimes. I don't know whether that answers your question, Aidan, but that's kind of our experience.
Yeah.
Does any of the work that you've done on Sacred, because I was interested in what you said about once Russell Brand had tweeted your podcast that was a really busy day at your end, and whether almost having an element of your communications being a lot more sort of, values based, conversations based, a lot more kind of engaged in the more conversation in society as well as the kind of more research side, whether that's sort of, if anything, kind of changed your sense of your brand, your brand personality and your values, for kind of, if it's changed how you've been perceived and therefore how you perceive yourselves and therefore how you approach your work, just because of that new level of profile, I suppose.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we actually did develop a kind of sub-brand for the Sacred. So the Sacred has actually got its own Twitter handle. It's called Sacred_podcast, if any of you want to check it out. The Sacred's got its own Twitter handle and Instagram page, and it's got a very different tone of voice. And we've developed brand guidelines for the Sacred, which is actually very different to Theos. So I suppose we do probably have this challenge actually, and you know, every organisation's got its challenges. I think sometimes we think, are we leaning more towards that kind of conversational, open air space kind of thing, and actually some of the team, you know, we need to be more concrete, and we want to be talking about kind of bigger ideas and more kind of meaty subjects. And so I don't know. I don't think it's changed the way that we see ourselves. I think if anything, it's just added a bit more of a lightness to what was potentially, before I joined, a bit of a kind of sometimes a little bit stuffier kind of highbrow perception, whereas you know, this has kind of lightened things a little bit. Does that make sense?
I think that's, yeah, it does, and I think that's really interesting, because I think sometimes when we you know, talk about the fact of, you know, we want to see think tanks do more storytelling, that in some ways we think a bit at Custom Clay about the actual brand of think tank, and whether or not that is a kind of a helpful, I think someone mentioned it in the, I think it might have been you, Aidan, in one of the sessions earlier, that the term covers quite a, you know, different, a broad range of organizations, and you know, that it can immediately be shut down by, that's not what think tanks do, though. They don't do that. And it's really interesting to see the kind of range of stuff that you guys do, that it's a bit like, you know, not being too sort of precious over an idea of kind of almost a genre of work, and you know, where you feel like that it's the right decision to make, to change your brand, to kind of have a slight separation in what you're doing. You know, that there are ways around that if people are kind of concerned about, oh, well, you know, will it sort of in some ways erode our reputation as a very serious think tank, that there are kind of ways of working with that, and like you said, it's kind of going back to your analogy of sowing the seeds, that it's thinking, okay, you know, how can we work our what we're trying to achieve into different formats, and maybe that's through something that we haven't talked about, which you know, was said in Aidan's discussion about narratives and their direction, is around the role of kind of collaboration and working with other organizations and other people who might be able to sow seeds in other areas that you can't quite get to, because it's not quite what your strength.
There's some really like, you know, interesting conversations going on, like, you know, with you know, thanks to like, on think tanks, and Isabel for like from Oxfam for like, you know, convening that, like, there's a lot of interesting conversations going on around kind of like the power of collective action, and I think we're kind of probably just at the start of like, you know, the conversation at the moment. But I would, you know, urge everyone, like, you know, who hasn't you know, read like, you know, that on think tanks and like, you know, Oxfam report and narrative, like, you know, please do, because there's like a lot of work has, like, you know, gone into that, and it's some like, you know, truly excellent work. And I think, you know, also Erica's shared a link to like a piece they wrote about the think tank label, which is I think a must read. So we're coming to the end of our session, so thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks, Lizzie, for sharing your experience. I hope everyone found it you know, found it interesting to actually see what that actually looks like in real life, and to realise that, like, you know what, like, it doesn't require a massive budget to take part in you know, in storytelling and help to shape narratives. So on that note, I am going to let everyone go. Thanks, Katy, and yeah, like, see everyone. Thanks for joining.
Yeah. Bye. Thanks for joining. Thanks, Lizzie. Thanks, Aidan. Bye.